Hi guys, in this video I would like to present further preparations on my dinghy for the final assembly. As it is easier for me to do the coating and gluing of the hull parts in the basement, I decided to prepare all assemblies of the hull as far as possible. These assemblies are the bow reinforcement, the transom and the centerboard case. The front longitudinal reinforcement is also the stem and the front keel beam. To reinforce the plate, I first laminated two 3 mm thick and 20 mm wide strips of ash wood around the lower edge. Epoxy thickened with cotton flakes was used for this. The ends were then shortened, fillets were made to reinforce the connection, and everything was coated twice with epoxy, except for the bonding surfaces to other components, which were therefore masked. An anchor or a spinnaker trumpet or something like that might later be placed in the bow, so it was reinforced with a 220 grams per square meter fiberglass mat. Then all pre-coated surfaces were painted twice wet on wet with 2K PU paint. The next assembly is the transom. A 25 by 20 mm ashwood strip runs along the upper edge, which was sawn according to the dimensions of the plate. This later ends at the inner side walls, so space was left at the ends accordingly. Overall, the transom consists of a base plate, strips, a reinforcement plate for the rudder, and connecting plates for the side walls and the deck. In addition, the connection between the transom and the keel is reinforced with a bracket which also contains the mount for hiking straps. First, the main plate was reinforced inside and out with a fiberglass mat. I did that at the same time as the centerboard case. The main sheet will later be connected to the outer ends of the ashwood strip via a line, so I drilled the corresponding holes here before gluing. Then, as always, the parts were cleaned, epoxy-coated surfaces with acetone and bare wood with a damp cloth. Unfortunately, the camera turned off during gluing, but after aligning, gluing with thickened epoxy and clamping, it looked like this. I then rounded the edges with a router and sanded everything smooth. As the entire rudder was already finished, I was able to transfer the positions for the holes for the fittings to the reinforcement plate and drill the holes using a piece of wood that I had just drilled accurately. Then again everything was coated 2 times with epoxy resin and 2 coats of 2K PU paint, except for the connecting surfaces. Finally, the fittings for the main sheet were screwed on. The most complex assembly is the centerboard box. According to the plotted marking for the bolt, the side parts were drilled with a 11 mm drill bit. This is clearly too large and serves to create space for filling the area with epoxy to prevent water from penetrating the plywood. Then wooden strips of ash were sawn out according to the thickness of the centerboard plus spacers, which were so large that the centerboard can just be folded in and out. The side panels were also coated inside and out with a fiberglass mat, and the 11 mm holes were filled with epoxy. After that, everything was sanded. Then 25 times 20 mm ashwood strips were glued along the bottom edge. The edge is curved according to the shape of the hull, so they had to be well braced. At first they were a little too long at the ends and were therefore shortened. Then the remaining strips were adjusted and glued on. These are straight. After drying, they were rounded and sanded and coated with 2 layers of epoxy. Also, the inner keel panel was prepared at that time. The upper edges were rounded and the top was coated with fiberglass. Next, the insides of the panels were coated with 2 coats of PU varnish, masking the glued surfaces of the middle strips. Then the parts were placed on top of each other, aligned, clamped together, and holes were drilled for the 8 mm dowels, 2 at the front and 2 at the back directly into the ash strips to make it more difficult for them to break apart due to delamination. Then thickened epoxy was applied onto the gluing surfaces and everything was put together. The hole for the centerboard was then drilled into the center of the epoxy-filled hole. It will later be screwed into a sleeve nut which sits flush in a block of wood, and this block is screwed in so that everything is tight and no water can reach exposed wood. This nut must be positioned exactly over the center of the hole. After curing, the protruding ends of the middle strips were removed using a flush cutter and a Japanese saw. The keel beam was then glued onto the bottom opening, paying attention that everything was centered correctly. I coated the contact surfaces with unsickened epoxy first and then applied thickened epoxy to the underside of the centerboard box. Then the centerboard case was placed on the beam aligned and clamped from front to back. Oozing epoxy was removed as far as possible. The lower cutout for the centerboard was then milled into the keel beam using a flush cutter. The assembly was then sanded and painted as usual except for the contact surfaces to the hull and the main frame. Since I don't know what the final position of the centerboard should be, I built a variable locking mechanism. One rope pulls the centerboard up and one pulls it down. Both ropes can be clamped in rope clamps, with the frontal one being deflected ones. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you soon. Ciao.